Okay, hey everyone in the weird sphere. So this is Jonathan and Fear yet again, in Wurundjeri land in Melbourne, and you're in Oxfordshire, right?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Um, in the land of the Uffington Horse.
Oh,
That's
absolutely.
Berkshire. I'm confused. Anyway,
Yeah, I can explain all about
yeah,
that in a
yeah,
second.
yeah. So we are here again, and this particular kind of installment is actually we don't have a set task to fulfill. Not that we ever do. Uh, but we are going to have a ramble. So just kind of like imagine that you're with us by some lovely hedge, and we're like picking belladonna and all sorts of interesting things with gloves on. Um,
Yeah.
and we have little hedgehogs, and they're like scurrying around with us, and we have jackdaws and foxes, and just join the party. So, so before we pressed record, Jonathan and I were having quite a lively discussion about race, whiteness, um, de- basically decolonization, identity, and white privilege. So let's start there.
Yeah. Um, I think one of the things, what we were kind of talking about was specifically uh, a controversy that erupted on the internet when a witch of color tweeted that, uh, as far as she was concerned, um, you know, white people had no right to be practicing witchcraft, that witchcraft was something that should be left for women and I believe trans folk of color. And both Theo and I were, well, I mean, we were kind of talking about that. And you know, and I mentioned that the thing that I really, I didn't mind, like when I read that tweet, I was like, okay, I disagree with that for various reasons, but I don't really feel it's my place or particularly, needful or healthy for me to kind of stand up and be, oh no, I disagree with this, because that I think I can see where that point comes from, and I can understand and sympathize with a lot of the reasons why someone would raise that sort of that point. But there were a lot of people who didn't view it like that and were like, we've got to assert this. And one of the things that really made me go, oh, was not the original comment itself at all, even though I disagreed with it. It was when people then came back and said that witchcraft, of course, witchcraft is white. Of course, witchcraft is something that white people can do, and there's this connection between whiteness and witchcraft. And I was just like, no, like, because I think that just shows this kind of lack of awareness about the fact that whiteness is a kind of it's a political category of privilege that's been constructed relatively recently
Uh-huh,
for specific purposes of exclusion
uh-huh,
and marginalization and oppression.
uh-huh.
And I feel that in a sense, like, when you look at what witchcraft is for and what witchcraft does as a spiritual practice, or indeed if you're talking about other pagan practices like that reach back to to deeper histories and deeper myths and things that predate the construction of whiteness as a category, then to simply sort of say, to kind of marry the two together in that, and to say, oh yes, this is absolutely a good thing, has really, really, really troubling political consequences and is either wrong or bad, and often both.
Mm.
So yeah, that was where I was at with it.
Yeah.
And
I think for me, and I was like, whew. When I saw that, like many things on Facebook, when when I saw that and like the 300 to 500 responses, I literally said, no fucking way. And several people did engage me, on this. They were like, "You're a mixed race witch. Why don't you like post something?" I'm like, "Who for? What for? What do you want
yeah,
me to say?" Like I'm not here to guard and sanction and be your convenient third road, so so that things are smoothed over, which I think unfortunately sometimes they end up being. And this is something that I struggle with inside, as well, like treating myself as a third road, and as a convenient, kind of smooth and easy bridge. You know, like I have the fortune. I don't even like saying that, because that instantly I can see how that's linked to capitalist thinking immediately when I say that, because of what I'm about to say. But I have privilege in that I'm lighter skinned, than my father, who is quite dark skinned, and even to my sister. And so I also have certain features that aren't often construed to be like that, you know, most people say are either ethnically Middle Eastern, which can cause me problems, or ethnically Greek or Italian, right? So I have this interesting kind of dilemma already with how people project onto me and how I move through the world, and with ease or discomfort according to who is storying me. So when I see things like that, I go, cool, this person of color who is obviously practicing some form of witchery is saying this thing out of various places of marginalization, oppression, suppression, anger, rage, discomfort, disquiet, pride, assertion, audacity, magic and sorcery. And that's fine.
Yeah.
You know, like and the fact that was such an intense full-on issue, and that other issues, like other, you know, people who are read as white in Western and imperialist capitalist cultures, like those kind of like witches and pagans who are leaders, who are doing far more like kind of who are doing much more fucked up shit, and who don't get as much airtime. It just boggles my mind. Airtime, I mean, in terms of critique, airtime for critique, because like it boggles my mind a little bit that this one like woman of color was so like kind of like the point of so much controversy. And I do think race has something to do with that, or what we talk about as race, the category of race, because when a person of color says anything anywhere, it it becomes a piece of political fodder. You know, like when any person of color, especially in the witchcraft world, well, not especially, but in any world that is highly populated by people who are read as white and who privilege that in that way. Like when you have, like, for instance, when I first went to my first big pagan public event, which was like apparently 4,000 people were there. It was in the middle of Brisbane City, 2002, Pagan Pride Day. I went to this angelic magic workshop, and it was like a kind of Alexandrian Reconstructionist. By Alexandrian, I mean the city, the Ptolemaic city. I don't mean the Wiccan tradition. So like an Alexandrian Reconstructionist angelic magic thing. And I went there, and the teacher was white, light-skinned man of European descent. And I said, oh, you know, I was 14 years old, and he said, oh, what's your background? Immediately, like as I walked up to him, and I was like, I didn't really know what he meant. And then he was like, what's your nationality? You know, I was like, I'm Australian. if we're being specific, like that, my nationality in my passport is Australian, and but my ethnicity is, you know, I'm half Balinese and half of Irish and English and Scottish descent. And he said, oh, well, I don't think he heard the latter part, but anyway, not that mattered. He said, well, why don't you go to that Hawaiian magic workshop over? Like, I was like, whoa. Yeah. So because I'm half Islander, you want me to go to the Pacific Islander magic workshop? I was just so like, you know, and this is a large tangent, but what I'm saying is that the narrative, the centralized narrative in many pagan circles is white. And so this cultural appropriation conversation, or cultural misappropriation conversation, or cultural exchange, or anything to do with any of this whatsoever, is so hard for people of color, and who are in those communities, because all we often see is a lot of white people flinging shit back and forth at each other, and using and appropriating our lives and voices and magic to win a debate.
Mm.
Rather than not even allowing us, we don't need you to allow us, but rather than getting out of the fucking way and listening to the voices of people of color in these communities who are speaking intelligent, articulate, wonderful, eloquent, messy, troubled, powerful, mighty, and listening to those voices. Just as I think in Australia right now, everyone who is not Indigenous to this country should shut the fuck up and listen to those who are.
Yeah.
You know, so it's full on.
Absolutely.
I think when, you know, Bell Hooks is right. You know, like I live in what is called the West. She says that this is a white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy. She's correct. And that's something that I know, battle with every day. Like, we are quagmired and affected by these systems, and they are so unquestioned by the large majority. Even though we all know, I don't know if we're all fulfilling the charge to be as educated as possible about these things. But we have to completely rip it down. We have to completely dismantle this. We have to decolonize ourselves before we can ever try to do any of the other work, which most elders of most First Nations will say. Like, they will point the finger right back at you if you or I try to ask how can we help you in paternalistic fashion. Like, you know, please absolve me of my colonial guilt. I have to do that. It's my job, not a First Nations person's job.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, you know, I've been frequently involved. I'll hold my hands up in the mea culpa. Frequently involved in that kind of white people slinging shit back and forth about cultural appropriation and similar issues. And you know, it's kind of, oh no, there we go.
Yeah,
I thought we lost signal, but yeah, I mean, I've frequently done that, and I think the key thing that I sort of, or where I sit with it, is, you know, it's that process of you know, of decolonization of the self and understanding what the most ethical course is, what the right course is complicated, and you're going to make mistakes, and you shouldn't. And I feel that one of the things that I've had to kind of learn about myself is that there's this appetite to be in the right, this desire, this, you know, ferocious.
How Protestant, Jonathan?
Huh?
How Protestant?
How Protestant? Absolutely. There is this terror that so many people in our in you know, circles that I've been part of, whether or not pagan or otherwise, have of being wrong or in the wrong and of doing something wrong, and they don't view it as being. My mum said just from the corner, "I'm never wrong," and she was brought up very, you know, Presbyterian, very Protestant, and she, you know, and we're many of us internalize that attitude. Where we're terrified of being in the wrong. And if someone comes up to us and says, you know, particularly if it's a person of color, right, comes up and says, actually, that was really, you know, an issue and we need to talk about it, the reaction is either, I didn't do anything wrong. How could you possibly say I did anything wrong? I'm really loving, or is to kind of be like, you know, to then engage in some kind of crusade, you know, and what gets lost in it is the actual human relationship, like the actual need that someone's come up and said, you know, we need to talk about this, and the other person's like, oh, you know, and it just means that, you know, I think that we, like, the thing that I've learned to do is just to kind of accept that I'm going to make mistakes and accept that I'm going to do things wrong, but continue trying my best not to. Holding those, and that doesn't make me better than anybody else, but that is just the only way you can really proceed, because realistically you're going to make mistakes, and realistically, you know, the best thing you can do is just try not to. and that doesn't make you better. That's just pragmatism, really.
I'd love to share a story that I think of as a teaching story now. Not that I'm teaching you or anyone, but so I know you've heard me talk about this before, but it's about this so this British Columbia witch camp that I co-taught at in 2014, right? I think it was its 27th year, so it's like beginning of its Saturn return cycle. So this was the 27th camp of that camp. And it's in what is now what settlers call British Columbia in Canada. I think it is. The camp is on unceded Squamish territory, and so this camp in particular. So every witch camp has a story or a theme or a myth, and that myth is the overarching magical landscape that we journey through to do our work as witches between the worlds. So the whole camp is between the worlds. That we ritually magically set it up that way after we give grace and honor to the spirits of the land. Okay, so most of us, who go are at least semi or fully what we would call white, fully. Quotas and bullshit. It's such a thing. People of European descent or something like that, who are searching for ancestry, who are searching for tradition and lineage, legacy, inspiration, but I would say probably more than that in reclaiming, who are searching for a rapturous, who are searching for a rapturous covenant with the imminent. That's what I would say. People who are moved by Starhawk's poetry and theology and writings, they're not always like looking necessarily for their European heritage. They're looking for that. They're looking for the soul of the earth and the stars. So this camp in particular, we after the teaching team, 8 of us, we were handed 3 stories that the community itself had visioned during the previous camp. Those 3 or maybe 4, I can't quite remember, stories were, one was how Isis took Ra's name or got Ra's name, the Norns, and maybe including Odin. These were like the pieces of vision that were sent to us. Salmon, that was another one, just salmon. And then Ganesha. And so the teaching team, over maybe 2 or 3, an hour and a half to 2 hour long Skype meetings, did our own magical process and divinatory process where we realized, it's Ganesha. And there are a few people on that team who are very rightfully kind of like, oh, this is going to open a bag of worms. Like, because this is a camp. Which camps people pay to go to these intensives? They're often 6 to 7 nights long. They're the teachers get paid, not a whole lot, like, not that much, but we get paid for our work, for the work of facilitating, priestessing, working out the magic, the ritual, the path, the education portion. Like, there's a fucking lot of work, and the organizers do so much work for over a year to put this thing on. Food and bedding. No, no one's making a profit. The witch camp entity is a not-for-profit entity. And so, there's already some political and social issues coming up here. And who are we, a group of mostly white people, to appropriate or maybe misappropriate this story, right? And I was selected to be on this team before we knew it was going to be Ganesha. So they did not hire me to be on this team as someone who was raised Hindu. That was just potentially a curious detail, right? Anyway, the issue is that this is complex, right? Because there is no answer to this. Was this particular reclaiming witch camp in the wrong? I actually still don't have an answer. Would we do that again? I don't have an answer because what I came to realize in that 6 to 7 days and everything that has happened since and before that time, there was a lot of controversy. There was a lot of contention. There was a small group of politically and socially justice-oriented activists who are also reclaiming witches and pagans, who are very not okay with this and were critiquing us as a teaching team, which was great. Great, thank you that there was that happening. That group of people ran a camper-led path about decolonization and cultural appropriation. That was great. We supported it. It happened. It was great. The camp was still a tense experience for many of us. Emotionally so, because it was also because we're also human and we were hurting each other's feelings and stepping on each other's toes. Here's the thing. That story, who does it belong to, right? It's about who does it belong to. Well, definitely it belongs to the Himalayan mountains. Definitely it belongs to the people who are devoted to those gods and embedded in those cultural customs and religious lineages. Definitely that's who it belongs to. So there is a discrepancy there. Now, the other issue here for me was this subconscious or unspoken of thread, which is that as people of European descent, we cannot touch stories that are brown, black, or whatever. We can't touch them. But also we're spirit workers. This is where it's layered, right? So we're spirit workers. If Kali knocks on the door of someone who is of Kimraic descent or who is of Slavic descent, if Kali knocks on their door, it is so fucked up to me that you'd go, oh, you're from India, I can't let you in the house. Can't do it. Like, if you're a spirit worker and this goddess is knocking on your door saying, I would like to talk to you, you fucking invite her in.
Yeah.
You know, like, so there is that as well. There was a racialist thing happening that was unspoken. I spoke it aloud several times. Like, and the other thing is we need to centralize the stories of cultures that are not white. You know, that's hard to say because you know, like, many Irish cultures are not white. Many Slavic cultures are not white by the definition of what we mean by whiteness. But do you know what I mean? We lots has happened because of empires. Many people in Europe who were once not white became white through empire. That's how a lot of people became white, of light skin. They became white through empire. And many people of color are white supremacist, like myself, like, because I have swallowed the bitter pill unconsciously by being raised in this culture. Do you know what I mean? Like, there are parts of me and many people of color that are white supremacist. And so for me as a person of color to say that, I don't know what a lot of white people who aren't maybe savvy to this kind of lingo are thinking when I'm saying that. It's like when a white person says, I'm racist. But we know by their actions that they're not. You know, it's like, so I urge people to get real with what's going on, you know, because it's a magical act, you know, like, to know as a person of color in America, in Australia, in England, oh, that's white. That's right. I am, this is a white supremacist culture. I have eaten that shit up. I didn't mean to. I'm fighting against it, but it's in there.
Yeah.
You know, it's in there. It's coming out in all sorts of ways. Person of color is such an interesting political narrative and identity. I remember when, I'll just say this and then hand it over to you. I was in this Pagans of Color caucus at Pantheacon last year in 2016. And you know, it was a place for pagans of color. So you self-identified, you walk through the door, no one was there to police your skin tone. There were many people there who were much lighter than me. You know, I'm kind of coffee colored. There were many people who were much darker than me. So yeah, there were like people who you'd look at and go, that's a white person. So there were many people, there were about 80 people. We all kind of checked in with each other. And then there was all this talk. I didn't say anything because I'm not black. I'm not of African descent and living in the US, right? So the issues that needed to be spoken about in there were First Nations issues related to Turtle Island and black issues related to being of African descent and living in the US and being a US citizen. Those were the issues that needed to be spoken about, not my issues. But I did hear an Indian woman who was born and raised in India, who'd moved to the US, and she said that she said, you know, I did not identify as a person of color before I came to the US. I did very recently as a political action. And that's the thing. So when someone says I'm a person of color, it is like saying I'm queer in a way. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like saying, you know, we're complex. Like, so many people are very in spiritual communities are like, oh, I don't like labels. I don't like labels. I don't, yeah. And you know what drives me crazy about that is I'm like, well, don't talk then. Go live in a fucking cave. Like, and I will celebrate you. I will celebrate you in that cave doing what you're doing. But honey, some of us actually need our labels because for us, their emancipatory devices. When I say I'm a person of color, I am communicating mostly to myself that I am trying to liberate myself from the bedrock of white supremacist culture. And so to be in a room of about 80 pagans of color all doing that with each other was very consciousness raising. Thank you, feminists. And just very healing for me. There are things that happen when I've been only with pagans of color or people of color that cannot happen with the eyes of white people upon us. Just as I know that women must gather together, that queer people must gather together, that trans people must gather together, and all collections in between. Because sometimes for those of us who are marginalized and suppressed and oppressed by systems of power, we need to not be looked upon by those who might be part of groups who do oppress us in some way in the system. And that is a magical act. And so I implore, any I don't want to call you white, but you have that privilege. Any white pagans and witches and people watching this to consider that, to consider, racism and white supremacy in your communities and in your traditions, and to consider how you might better learn from First Nations people and people of color and women and trans people and trees and mountains and rocks and stars. Like,
absolutely. No, I completely. I just completely agree. I think, yeah. I mean, it's there's actually, so one of my colleagues actually is about to submit her thesis on goddess feminism and racism and colonialism in Glastonbury. Her name is Gavita Meyer, and if you're listening to this, do look her up. She's written a couple of articles, blogs and things already on her research, but as I understand it, she's currently figuring out the best way to disseminate and to kind of publish her findings. And obviously, the reason why I want to acknowledge her is that I've had a lot of conversations with her about these issues in the past in the pagan community, and I think, and so in a sense, I mean, one of the reasons why I think from those conversations, I feel that her intervention is going to be, if she may well decide to, however she decides to make it, I think that that sort of research into those sorts of issues, that sort of, whether or not it takes place in an academic context or in an activist context, where people are really kind of, critiquing existing practices, where we're reflecting upon the way things have been done up to this point, are so important and are so valuable. And I think, obviously, there is a real need for people who have white privilege, people who are of predominantly European descent or are coded as such because of the way they present externally, because obviously in the UK you've got the concept of whiteness intersecting with concepts of British ethnicity, because obviously there are lots of people, recently there have been people who've been attacked and murdered because they're Polish, so that even though they would count as white in America, because they are Poles, they are seen as being outsiders. There's a lot of xenophobia.
Humans are nasty shitheads.
Really nasty shit. And another group who are subjected to that are travellers. A lot of traveller people. It's perfectly acceptable still in UK society to be profoundly bigoted and abusive and vile towards travellers, be they Irish travellers or Romani people. And all of those different forms of bigotry and marginalisation. There needs to be a willingness to allow to step back, basically, and sort of get out of the way, and also to kind of be receptive and open, and not just to kind of say, well, it's none of my business, because
engage, right? Like something like, especially like, again, in the reclaiming tradition, a lot of us I said something really clear for myself, and then I wrote it, right? Like, I was like, look, we sleep in beds with people of, and the we is interesting, but I'm speaking as both a person of color and someone of European descent in a witchcraft tradition, right? But like, I sleep in a bed with myself, but we sleep in beds with people of color who are our lovers. We're in coven with people of color. We're walking and marching down the streets protesting nuclear sites or fucking Trump or like rape culture with people of color, and all the other groups who are oppressed, like trans people and you know. God, just a list of barrage goes by. I'm like, you know who we're talking about. Um, and I just think that, especially in a witchcraft context and in a spirit working context, it would be strange if some of my gods did not rub off on you.
Yeah.
And so to be real about modern witchcraft, we can't be like sectioning off little racialist lines like what, and I'm not saying don't be proud of your heritage. I'm so like, I love working with the Irish gods, right? I love working with my father's gods, and I also work with gods who are absolutely not ethnically connected to me at all, but who are, through cultural legacy, through witchcraft cosmology, through streams that I am initiated in. So it is very complex. It is very multi-layered. But to put up your hand and go, oh, I can't. I like, out of respect. It's like, but out of respect, speak to me. Like, out of respect, consider that over time cosmologies and develop in which gods of color are going to be central to your communities.
Mm.
Like certainly Yemaya, a West African Yoruban Orisha, has become very important and central to many reclaiming communities on the West Coast, where the great fucking Mother Ocean is right there. And there are many Yoruban influences in our magic. And reclaiming tradition has reclaiming tradition had quite early on quite a strong Yoruban influence, actually. So, it's important to know one's tradition and one's context and one's place in the world, because I could see like a really intense. I once said to someone, maybe many people, there's nothing scarier to me than well-intentioned white people. so I that's a segue into this, right? For like a well-intentioned white person who might be part of, I don't know, like another tradition, right, to look at reclaiming and go, well, you're all just eclectic, like cultural appropriators, blah. How that's like, do you know our history? Like, do you know who some of our mentors are? Do you know who Starhawk learned from? Do you know that Starhawk is not the pivot of reclaiming? Did you know that many people of color are in reclaiming? And it's contentious for us, but we're in that tradition for a reason, because it's avowedly political, it's avowedly directed to social justice, and while that doesn't mean it's the only one doing that work, the only tradition doing that work, its ethos and magic is embedded in that work. There is a reason people of color and pagans and witches of color are drawn to reclaiming, just as much as they're drawn to any other tradition as well, like the fairy tradition. There's a lot of people of color who are drawn to Anderson Fairy, which is one of the roots of reclaiming, because Anderson Fairy is an American traditional witchcraft. Like it is a syncretic witchcraft that could only have happened in that country.
Absolutely. And I think in a way, I feel that the almost like the acid test, if you like, for these sorts of things. If to use your example, Carly comes and knocks on someone's door, right? Now, let's take that to a human situation. If you end up in a relationship with a person of color, they come and knock on your door, right? And you're in a romantic relationship or you're a friend, then the question becomes, what are your relationships with their family? Are they respectful? What are your relationships with their political sort of being in the world, and the political being in the world that is put onto them by the society in which we live? Is that respectful? And so if one's relationship with Carly is just entirely just Carly, and you will do racist, you will make insulting people from India, like, and you know, and lobby to have, you know, international aid budget slashed, and we'll talk about how wonderful the British Empire was, then it's quite clear that your relationship with her is shallow and doesn't acknowledge the fullness of her relationships with other people, because that is.
It's funny that we're talking about Carly, because if this was happening, which it does, she would kill you.
Really?
Well, not kill you, but she would fucking do.
Oh, what if one was doing? If one was doing that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. Like, I mean, but the point is I think in a way it's kind of like it's being ignorant of those extended relationships,
absolutely,
and being disrespectful to those in general relationships.
Yeah.
That is the problem. So, like, I mean, I've encountered that same ignorance in a way, but obviously not in a kind of a racist white supremacist context, when having conversations with American pagans about various different aspects and identities in Britain and Ireland. So they will often say things like so I have encountered American sort of American pagans who have very close relationships with Irish gods or with Celtic gods, who will say that Obod is just culturally appropriative because it's just a bunch of English people who want to relate to these gods and these beings. And I'm always a bit like, you know, because there are loads of like Irish and Welsh and Scottish people who are members of Obod, and there are lots of members of Obod like me who are Irish and Welsh and English. And it's like you know, so people who say that, they say that to me, and they're invalidating my existence as a kind of a person who has, like, because the whole point is that these, you know, the constituent, you know, the different nations that live in these islands have a long and complicated history. And yes, that long and complicated history has involved the English state and the British state acting as violent, you know, evil fucking monstrous plantationers and colonizers of the other nations, and have marginalized and brutalized the people in those nations. But to sort of say that, you know, but to take that and remove all the other connections and interrelationships and friendships and collaborations that have emerged in addition to that history, which can never be forgotten and should never be forgotten, is kind of is something that you would never do if you actually lived on these islands. You'd never do that if you lived on these islands, because it's part of your lived experience. But it's possible to do if you're completely far removed. You know, it's possible to sit in that position of ignorance. And the point is that, you know, if an American pagan decides to do that and write some invective against Druidry in Britain on the basis that it's not authentically Irish or something, then they're not going to be able to hurt me, really. They're not going to be able to hurt Obod, really. It's maybe slightly irritating, but that doesn't have a kind of a pullback for us. It's just kind of like, well, you know. But if that difference was backed up by a structural system of oppression and marginalization, then you can really see how someone having that kind of ignorance and that kind of, you know, cherry picking approach would cause, you know, both kind of cause deep spiritual harm, emotional harm, but also kind of physical harm, also actual psychological harm, also, you know. So it kind of, like, what I think is kind of the thing that always strikes me about this is that, you know, is that ignorance of those relationships and that unwillingness to actually, you know, apply to the gods the principle of love me, love my family, like, or love my friends. Like, if you don't apply that to the gods, that can lead to you making horrible shit for other people in the world even worse. And I feel that's why, you know, as you're talking about the context of reclaiming and how reclaiming goes about it, that is lived through relationships. That's lived through exploring precisely those connections, as you were describing it. And I feel that that's really, really important. And I feel that
I agree with you, and I don't want to paint a rosy picture of reclaiming. You know, we suffer.
I don't want to paint a rosy picture of Obod either. Like,
as a tradition,
there are issues.
Yeah, we have a lot of issues in reclaiming, and most of our leaders are white, and because most of them are also American, and and I count many of them as my beloved mentors. They've taught me so much about this work, about the craft, about love and relating. And I also do know, like, I also have to say that I've been around lots of witches of many traditions, and I am proud of reclaiming and being a reclaiming witch, because at least we, as a culture, we risk the work, we turn up to the work. There are many covens and traditions that couldn't give a shit. They do not have these discussions. They do not do this work. They do not gather for 4 or 5 nights on a mountain like I did recently, at Cloudcatcher Witch Camp with a bunch of reclaiming witches to literally do the magic of decolonization. And we did not appropriate an indigenous myth. We had a story. Two priestesses wrote a story, channeled a story about the plateau, about the mountain, about the caldera. And we did that story, the story of pain and colonization and history, but also the story of trees and fire mountains and oceans and tectonic plates, which that belongs to all beings, that story. So it's very, you know, it brings me to this. If one is doing witchcraft if one is doing witchcraft properly, if one is doing paganism properly, it's not a comfortable path. You know, because if one is doing druidry properly, because our gods, the ethos that our traditions are embedded in, they are not about being right. They are not about having the right answer. They are not about conquering and conquest. They are not about the cleanliness of an idea. They are not Protestant. They are not, you know, our traditions come out of spirit workers tripping balls on mushrooms and falling into a river and getting married to the god of that river. Our traditions come from, you know, 80,000 people getting fucking killed in some weird hysteria that actually changed forever the consciousness of what has become Europe because of that event. Like, you know, our traditions come from strange places, and they are not. We do not have humans. This is the thing. Pagan traditions and witchcraft traditions, we do not have humans at the center.
No.
And we all need to shut the fuck up. The other thing I've noticed, and I count myself in this, I'm not, you know, is we are so opinionated as pagans, which is something I love about us. We love to talk, we love to philosophize, we love to argue and squabble and debate and connect and exalt and cherish and adore. And at the end of the day, also, we need to shut the fuck up in our rituals and in our communions and listen to the other than humans, who are the center of our traditions.
Listen to the land speak.
Yeah.
There are 2 things I want to add, and one directly speaks to that. The first is that in terms of, I realize, and I'm in the process of kind of acknowledging when I make mistakes and things, I want to clarify something I said, because I said in Britain people wouldn't make that mistake of kind of glossing over their relationships and stuff. And as I was thinking as I was talking, and I realized that actually they do, and obviously it's usually English people who do.
Yeah.
But particularly, but that is because of their particular position of privilege. And I feel like what I meant was, I think the error that you'd make is different. So a perfect example of that is Brexit, right? None of the English people who voted for Brexit thought about what the impact of Brexit would be on the island of Ireland. They didn't think about a hard border and what that would mean. They didn't think about the fact that the Northern Irish peace process rests on European human rights law. They didn't think about any of that. They just thought about, and that is an example of their ignorance. But that is, I would say that is a different kind of ignorance. And I would say that's an ignorance of privilege. That's not an ignorance of distance. And I feel that the two can shift and merge into each other. And I felt like I wasn't acknowledging that. So
that's great. We're all in process.
My bad. I should have acknowledged that. But the second thing that I was going to say is talking about letting the land speak. Because we mentioned at the beginning we were going to talk about Oxfordshire and Whitehorse and Berkshire and stuff. Because you're right, like the land it's all about, like, it's that process of kind of going out and falling into a river and becoming married to the spirit of the river, or sleeping out on a mountaintop overnight and hearing the story of the plateau. That is, in a sense, that is where it's at. And what's interesting about, so, you know, the question of whether or not we're in Berkshire and Oxfordshire is kind of, there's basically a big chunk of Berkshire ended up getting amalgamated into Oxfordshire when I think in the late 19th or early 20th century, including the White Horse of Uffington. But yeah, we nicked it off Berkshire. But what you have, I would say, is interesting is if you set aside the counties for a time and you think about the landscape and what the landscape tells you, that basically there is this spine of chalk that runs all the way from Avebury in the west, right across where the White Horse of Uffington is, and you follow it when you go on the train. You follow it, and then you can see it on your, if you're heading eastwards, you see it on the south side through the southern window, and it follows all the way up until you reach the Thames, where there is a gap through the chalk that was cut by a vast lake of meltwater from the glaciers that burst through and cut this vast channel through the chalk itself. It's the same process that created the channel in the first place. That used to be all dry land before the south. What is the South Downs and what becomes Champagne in northern France used to go all the way across until the North Sea kind of formed this vast freshwater lake of meltwater, and then it burst through and flooded the channel. Anyway, so this chalk ridge in the centre of the country on which the White Horse stands starts up again in the Chilterns, where I live, and it's the same chalk that runs all the way up to my mother's country up in Norfolk, where it kind of goes deep under upper layers of gravel and chalk and spreads out and reaches the North Norfolk coast, where it goes into the sea. And it's there that our ancestors dug up the best flint that was used for making tools that were then transported right up and down the country along the Ridgeway, we think, and the Icknield Way, which went all the way along that route. And so a lot of the things that, a lot of that story and a lot of that that history, I think, is kind of lost under the modern county structure. The fact that you have these geological provinces and these physical regions that was laid out by the country gets kind of people, you know, like the actual counties distract us from that a little bit. But what's interesting is that, you know, if you go back, what they've found is that a lot of the genetics of Britain still correspond to the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. So all the different blobs are of people's populations are still very similar to the waves of settlement that were that took place.
The Seven Kingdoms.
The Seven Kingdoms, the literal original Seven Kingdoms.
I know, it just makes me laugh.
I get so antsy about English nationalism because, like, you know, that is a very superficial, like, British nationalism is an even more superficial glaze on top of another superficial glaze that, like, Alfred created in the, you know, whenever it was 700 AD or something. You know, and that was I mean, I'm talking about 700 AD like it was yesterday. This is recent.
Yeah, it's so recent, you know,
That's
compared
like,
to
yes.
the melting of a glacier that split apart.
Exactly. See, that is true. So like, that's why I get really antsy about nationalism, because as far as I'm concerned, it's all just kind of,
yeah, it's bullshit.
It's not, and it's all relatively, and it was all created as an alternative to the localized land-based kind of identities that people also had. Because
See, this is the thing, like that, what you just said, localized land-based identity is how I define pagan, right? Because like when and that's what I'm being inspired by. So like that, when I explained that word to people, you know, a lot of people say rustic country dweller from the Latin paganus or pagani. I always go, well, actually look further back, you know, before paganus or pagani, you had pagus, and that's from the Greek region of the locale. So really then what a pagan is someone who is in deep relationship with a place, and that their sensibility and spirituality unfolds from their lived embeddedness in a place. And in this world, that is it's super hard to be pagan, really, because of all the shit we have to work through to even get to that. Like we're all fucking, many of us are so dispossessed and cut off at the roots. And ultimately, like tonight I was walking home and I have this monthly ritual where I sing this particular song, which is an interpretation of a Gaelic from that Carmichael collected in the Carmena Gadaleka. I sing this song every time I see the new moon. So it's called the Traveler's Prayer. And it's to the new moon. And I stopped and I saw it, even though it's a few days after the new moon. And I do it every month. And I sang that song, and I was a pagan in that moment, in direct relationship with how that moon is in this place, in this time, on the sidewalk I was in, with all the history around me. There was no romanticism there. There was just me and the moon, and my feet on the ground, and my voice. So,
wonderful.
You know, and I think we have to kind of wrap up, but I feel like you have another point. So get to it, Jonathan. Wrap this mother up.
Okay, so I think that is actually what we should maybe talk about in our next session. I don't know, maybe. Partly because that's actually what my thesis is all about. So I've got a lot to say on that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thesis.
Yeah. Did you just say feces or thesis?
Thesis. Feces is the plural.
No, I said feces.
Oh, feces.
I literally thought you were like feces, and I'm like
feces. Well, that too. I mean, feces are great, you know.
Yeah. As my friend Lily says, everything is blood.
We should talk about let's talk about the land and how one relates to it and how it's hard for us to relate to it.
No, that doesn't sound pagan at all. I thought paganism was about waving a giant weird sword made in China at a watchtower.
You can't be a good pagan unless you've got a good ironmonger and a good seamstress.
That's right. Empire.
All about the yeah, absolutely. No, we should definitely. I'd love to talk more about that.
Okay.
And so yes, we'll talk about that next time. And it's been wonderful. Thank you ever so much, as always.
Yep. You too. Okay. Mwah.
Mwah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.